got a little bit of an emergency going with the CEO's office. Let me talk to Glenn.
Okay.
Get started. No,
Great, thank you.
he's got to do something. Case the name show up.
I'm sorry.
Oh, these are newsletters.
Kelly, did you see the text or the email from Steve Bennett?
I'm responding right now, Chair.
Okay, this is Steve. I'm on.
All right, I guess Tony Trundley was having trouble getting on this link as well. I think there was some confusion about which link worked. Hopefully we'll get everybody together.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yes, Tony, I can. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just waiting on Dave Borchard. Those in the waiting room, we are returning from closed session, and there have been some technical confusion this morning, so we left Dave in one room. We should find him in this one eventually. Now, I thought I saw Mike Mobley's link attached, but now he's gone. Oh, okay, here comes Dave.
Some of the others were having difficulty too, but
Yes.
okay.
Keely, could you check and see if Mike Mobley is in the waiting room? Because I thought I saw his image pop up here again.
He is not, Chair West.
Well, why don't we go ahead and get started, and Michael will join us when he figures out the technical issue on his end. All right, it is 1:36. Oh, here he is.
No one is letting me in. And the link and the passcode is wrong.
No, we got to work.
That's
All right, it is
my complaint.
it's 1:36. We are returned from closed session to report no action was taken. And we're ready to reconvene the special meeting, the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Board of Directors. I'll ask for an agenda review. Any changes to the agenda?
No changes, Chair.
Thank you. And then we'll move on then to public comments. Anyone wishing to address the board on matters not otherwise on today's agenda is welcome to do so now. I ask you to raise your hand in the waiting room so the clerk of the board can recognize you and activate your mic.
Mr. Gonzalez?
You just need.
Mr. Gonzalez, are you with us?
I've got an error message on my screen. Apparently he's having difficulty connecting on his iPad. Then, Keely, why don't we mute Mr. Gonzalez, ask if there's anyone else who wishes to be heard while he's working on his technical issues. Anyone else for public comment at this time?
I do not see anybody else, Chair.
All right. Well, let's unmute Mr. Gonzalez again, see if he's worked that out. Mr. Gonzalez, can you hear us? Well, unfortunately, we can't hear you. Okay, we'll give you, Mr. Gonzalez says he's trying a different device. We'll give him a moment to see if he can connect.
Mr. Gonzalez?
Hello?
Now we can hear you.
Hi, how's it going? Let me unmute the computer. I guess there's another issue. Okay. Sorry about that. I really apologize. My name's Alfonso Gonzalez. I purchased the 5410 Lemonwood Drive property in Moore Park in December of 2017. My land has been planted with and irrigated since at least 1980. I looked at pictures from historicalaerials.com all the way through, in 1994, Google Earth started showing images of my property, and it's always been planted with avocado. I used to be a member of the Ventavo Well Group number 2, and the Ventavo Well Group number 2 has been destroyed and does not have any historical extraction allocation associated with it, as well as it failed before the base period, and efforts to renovate it, they weren't able to do it. And so there is no base period allocation that I can use. I was granted a permit to develop a well on my land, and in 2018, I was, I installed the well and did all that stuff. When I looked at the preliminary draft of the allocations, I noticed that I'm being allocated 0 acre feet a year. Now, what I irrigate is about 19.26 acres, and as you can imagine, not being allocated anything isn't going to help me. So I'm respectfully asking for, some kind, allocation be given to me to like what a similar avocado grower my size gets. I've always used the water. I've always met the agreements. I'm well invested in making sure I use the water properly. Part of those investments I've done in the recent, since installing the well, have been installing a new automated filter, fertilization system, moisture sensors, weather stations, a completely new irrigation system with net FM pressure sensing, micro sprinklers. I mean, I'm doing everything I can to be as efficient as possible here. All I'm asking is, for the same opportunities other people are getting. I don't think the rules are meant to, cause any harm or anything to farmers. So I'm just asking and respectfully requesting for the same opportunities other farmers are given.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. This is public comment. Technically, on public comment, the board is not permitted to engage in discussion, which is why public comment is usually reserved for matters that aren't on the agenda. The item that you've raised would be appropriate with respect to the pumping allocation ordinance that is on the agenda. And let me just suggest that if your questions aren't addressed in the discussion that you hear, why don't you raise it then? Because then we could respond to you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bet. Anyone else wishing to address the board on matters not otherwise on today's agenda? Hearing none, we'll move on then to board comments. Any members of the board have any comments before we move on to the primary agenda? Okay, hearing none, then we will move on then to item number 6, the proposed ordinance to establish a new pumping allocation system for the Las Posas Basin.
Good afternoon, Chair West, members of the board. For the record, I'm Kim Loeb, Fox Canyon staff. And so this is a public hearing and first reading of the draft ordinance that the board's been considering the allocation system, new allocation system for the Las Posas Valley. Let me share my screen, and I have a presentation. So you should be seeing the screen now, hopefully.
Yes.
Thank you. So just briefly, the background. The Las Posas Users Group began development of the new allocation system back in 2014. They worked on that in public meetings through 2015, and in 2016, April 2016, entered into a charter with the GMA to develop that new allocation system, and first presented it to your board in a more complete version, initial November white paper, as they called it, in December of 2016. Your board directed staff to work with the LPUG to develop an ordinance effective October 1st, 2017. And there was, in fact, a board workshop at a special meeting in June of 2017. And about that time, the faction called the Las Posas Valley Water Rights Coalition voiced opposition to the plan. And then we continued, your board's directed us to continue working on it at the time and to meet with both the Water Rights Coalition and LPUG members, which we did in November of 2017 and then March 2018. As we know, the adjudication was filed in the basin on March 18th and March 2018. And then further development of the ordinance was put on hold at that time. Then in October of last year, your board directed that new allocation ordinances be enacted, I made a new word, October 1st, 2020 in all basins, and directed that the ordinance be developed based on the LPUG white paper, and then some agreements that had been reached in a stipulation out of the mediation effort as part of the adjudication. And you made that direction at the 2020 meeting. Staff held a a workshop for stakeholders on July 21st. It was a Zoom workshop and went through the details of the plan for the ordinance and got a lot of good input and participation on that. And then this Monday, your executive committee met and provided discussion and recommendations and heard more input from stakeholders on specific provisions of the ordinance. We should talk about that input throughout the presentation. So the ordinance itself would be interim until the water rights for adjudication is completed in the basin. Like we said, it's based principally on the groundwater pumping allocation system white paper from June 2017, developed by LPUG. And includes those provisions from the stipulated agreement. At the Monday's meeting of the executive committee principally considered and provide recommendations on 4 areas, including the Epworth Gravels Management Area, initial allocations, minimum allocations, and dealing with codes that may span more than one management area. So I'll now get into an overview of the proposed ordinance. The ordinance has 17 articles, and we put the ordinance up on the website last week sometime, and of course it's part of the agenda package. Based on some of the discussion and recommendations at the executive committee meeting on Monday, late yesterday, we put forth a version with some red lines based on those discussions for your board's consideration. So the purpose of the ordinance is to facilitate a transition to sustainable groundwater management in the basin. And then, as we said, the ordinance specifically calls out that if the Superior Court does enter a decision on a comprehensive adjudication in the basin, it would be your board's intent to then amend the ordinance in a way that's consistent with any water rights priorities that are determined. It would replace, this ordinance would replace the allocation provisions in emergency ordinance and the agency ordinance code. The allocations are assigned to extraction facilities, i.e. wells, as they are now and as they have been traditionally in Fox Canyon. And an operator with more than one well can combine that with other wells under similar operation into a code for the purpose of combining their allocation. But unlike in the current ordinance code, which limits codes to basins, because the management areas have their own pool allocations, that would be limited to the management area with combining of the wells. Although there are some special circumstances that would need to be approved by variance, including Zone Mutual Water Company and Ventura County Waterworks District number 19 that have wells in both the east and west Las Posas management areas that operate together as a single system. Initial allocations are based on the operator's extraction in greater of the annual extractions during a 2009 through 2013 base period, the extractions in 2015, or a minimum allocation. That highest base period extraction is then for the combined operators wells, then is how the determination is made for the allocation to each well in that code, and that provides its pro rata allocation within the pool for the management area. We'll talk about that a little bit more in more depth as we move along. And I just got ahead of my bullet. That's what I was just saying. So there are allocation pools. The East Las Posas Management Area has 2 pools. Pool 1 is all operators other than the Ventura County Water Networks districts. And Pool 2 is the Ventura County Waterworks districts. These yield shares of the management area available yield are from the stipulated agreement. As are the ideas of the idea of the pools come from the white paper as well. In the West Las Posas Management Area, it's the same. There's the 2 pools, all operators other than the waterworks districts, and then the waterworks district wells in that management area, and those are the yield shares based on the stipulation. And then there's a third allocation pool in the white paper and in the draft ordinance for the Epworth Gravels Management Area, which is a sub area within the East Las Posas Management Area, defined as those operators who are extracting from within the Epworth Gravels aquifer. And that yield share in the draft ordinance is defined as the share of the pumping in that Epworth Gravels during the base period. So that percent share in the Epworth Gravels of the East Las Posas Management Area is how that's defined in the draft ordinance. However, as I mentioned, the issue of the Epworth Gravels Management Area was a topic of discussion at the Executive Committee. And the Executive Committee recommended that the Epworth Gravels Management Area be managed together as part of the East Las Posas Management Area until such time as allocation reductions are considered. And so in the red line version, we did provide some proposed red line text based on the Executive Committee's recommendations, should your board concur with them. And in 7.1.1, you can see the reference to Epworth Gravels would be struck there. And then in 7.3.4, the yield share would be struck because the yield share would be part of the East Las Posas Management Area, and they'd be managed together. The ordinance implements the reserve allocation pools that are defined in the white paper. And this is set aside from Pool 1, the non-waterworks district pool in both the East and West Las Posas management areas, principally for land that was not irrigated. That would be brought into production after 2015. And the allocation pools are 670 acre feet a year in East Las Posas and 320 acre feet a year in the West Las Posas. And we'll talk more about reserve allocations later in my presentation. The basin and management area yield shares has been a topic of some of discussion, I can say. Based on our understanding of your board's direction, the draft ordinance represented that the initial basin yield of 36,000 acre feet would be used based on the stipulation and divided into shares for the East and West Las Posas management area. Stakeholders at the Monday's Executive Committee expressed concern that the initial allocation shouldn't be based on that 36,000 acre foot a year value, which is less than the current extractions. And your Executive Committee recommended that it was the board's position and their recommendation that the initial allocation should start out compatible with the current pumping in the basin now. And as you should know, we did put out draft initial allocations, a preliminary draft of what those allocations might look like. We revised that yesterday and included more recent pumping. And I think there's been some confusion about what that table shows, but I think it'll inform your board's discussion, and thinking that I would like to pull that up and just briefly walk through that. So this is what it looks like. It's divided into the management areas. The Epworth gravel is at the top here, and part of the East Las Posas management area totals. And there's the management area, then there's the state well number, usage, whether it's ag, domestic, or M&I, the current status of the well, the average annual extractions for the well from 2009 through 2013, the extractions for the well in 2015, and then the 2018 and 2019 extractions. And then this is the max base period based on the combination of wells. It's either going to be the 2009 or 2013, 29 through 2013 or 2015 is the max extraction. And so the reason we looked at that by COM code, which is how we understood the operator to mean in the Las Posas, is because an operator that has many wells combined into a COM code, they may rotate the way they use those wells. And if within a single operator's combined wells, we took the highest extraction from each well, that could disproportionately provide a windfall to a particular COM code. Whereas if we take the highest pumping by that operator in a given period, and then in this column here where it says well extraction during COM code max, include that pumping during that period, that would be the more equitable way to bring those forward. That's then determines the pro rata share. So, and we sum up the max of this. Now your board may have a different direction, but that's how we put this together. And we realized that was that some people did have some confusion about that, and that's why we show that there. And here, for I would say the majority of wells, it's the same, but I highlighted this one here where this COM code, the well's part of, the highest pumping period was 2009 through 2013, although the higher pumping for this particular well was in 2015, but in totality it was in this period. So we pull the extraction from the year that COM code pumped. And that determines the pro rata allocation, which is just simply the sum of all the pumping, the highest pumping, that's divided into this number. And then we looked at two initial allocations. This is the one we looked at originally. And that is if the total allocation within the management area pool is restricted to the amount that was in the stipulation. Then in the table we released yesterday based on discussions at executive committee is we looked at what would it be if we took 2018, which is more recent pumping. The reason we took 2018 is because 2019 report extractions are quite a bit lower. We think that's an artifact due to some unreported extractions yet. So that's why we looked at 2018. We'll look at these totals in a minute. So that's what this shows. So for a particular well, for instance, this one that I highlighted that we talked about before, if the total pool is restricted to the amount under the stipulation, that's what the share of that well's pumping, the allocation would be. But if it was based on the 2018 pumping or total amount of pumping for the pool, then it would be this amount here. And I think that'll become clearer as I go back to the presentation and show the totals I've come up with. So what this is in that table I was just showing. This is a bit of a condensed version of that table showing the totals at the bottom for the East Las Posas at top, and then the West Las Posas, and then the basin as a whole, because I think it's important to look at the basin as a whole and the management areas as a whole to understand how all the pieces would work together. So looking at the East Las Posas, we can see that the sum of all the 2009, the average of the 2009 through 2013 is 19,800 acre feet. In 2015, it was 21,700. In 2018, it was 20,600 approximately. And here's where we see where the 2019 extractions don't appear to be complete yet. And then if we sum the max of the COM codes, either 2015 or 2009 through 2013, the sum of all that is 23,725. So it makes sense that the sum of the max would be more than the pumping has ever been in the basin, because different operators may have max pumping during a different base period. And that's just the nature of having two different base periods and taking the max. Then in order to show the what the total allocation would be in pumping and allocation would be in the basin, we added pool 2, and remember this is the waterworks district wells. And so these are the actual pumping averages and totals reported. And this is what the total would be here. And what we did was these percentage breakdowns between pool 1 and pool 2 are defined in the stipulation. So projecting forward, that's how we got the total pool 1, and then we just projected pool 2 based on that percentage, and we get the total pumping in the basin. There's that 21,600 for east we saw before, the 36,000 for the basin from the stipulation. But if we take the 2018 total here and we apply that to the allocations, then we get a total allocation of 39,000, almost 40,000 for the basin as a whole. If you were to take just whatever the high was and just said, okay, that's your starting allocation, and not constrain them pro rata to the a given total pool and management area allocation, the total would be almost 45,000 acre feet for the basin, which is more than I believe there's ever been extractions. So that was a lot of information I threw at you. But hopefully you're able to track that discussion for consideration as we move along. But I'll stop and see if there are any questions, clarification I need to make there. Not seeing any, I'll move on. So that's our staff recommendation at this time, is to move forward with that approach. And that is what the red line would implement. We get rid of the 36,000 acre feet per year yield, starting yield. And then we, in 4.7, we say the available yield is equal to the cumulative extractions in the basin during 2018, as reported to the agency. As food for your board's consideration of how the initial allocation pool or available yield, to use this terminology, is available in the basin. So I'll move on to minimum allocations, another area that was discussed at the executive committee. And the ordinance per the white paper implements minimum allocations for 3 types of operators: agricultural, domestic, and other operators. Other operators essentially being M&I. We'll talk about the agricultural operators next. Domestic operators, we have revised the definition slightly from what was in the white paper proposal, which was just simply 2 acre-feet per year per parcel to 2 acre-feet per year per well serving 1 to 4 residences. The reason for that is it kind of tightens it up, the 1 to 4 residences is the definition of a domestic well in the county well ordinance. More than 4 connections would be a small water system regulated by the county, or if it's larger, by the state. Other operators' minimum allocation is based on the temporary extraction allocation, or TA, established under Emergency Ordinance E, including all scheduled reductions, which was 20%, and including any variance that had been granted. So it would preserve those variances. So the minimum allocations for ag operators was defined in the white paper as the agricultural well owner operators, which is the ag portion of pool 1 in the current terminology, share of sustainable yield divided by the total irrigated acreage in each of the east and west management areas. The white paper recommended that the 2014-2015 irrigated allocation, irrigated IEI application irrigated acres be used as the basis for establishing irrigated acres. But there are some complexities in implementing this, not the least of all that not all operators submitted IEI applications in 2015. So there may be pumping reported, but irrigated acres not there. The data are complex because the water may be coming from multiple sources, not only groundwater. And at the August 10th executive committee meeting, stakeholders expressed that concern. Staff had recommended in your staff letter that because of these complexities, that perhaps your board should look at aerial photos of the irrigated acres in the management areas to start with determining the total irrigated acres. Stakeholders expressed concern with that approach due to the multiple sources of water and unknown sources of water to irrigate parts of that. And many of those, at least some portion of those lands may be being supplied by the waterworks district, so there was problems with that. Interestingly, LPUG members who are involved in developing this said they expected that it might take the first year of implementation to work out the ag minimum allocations, and they recognized it was a pretty data-intensive effort. One thing that I think is important to note, especially in terms of some of the comments that we have been getting recently, is that the minimum allocation was considered by LPUG and in the white paper to be based on the sustainable yield of the basin. There's been some discussion and comments that it should be based on minimum crop need. I can understand that. However, the total minimum allocation in the basin at some point it can't be a whole lot more than what the sustainable yield of the basin is, or there's a problem there. So that's food for thought. Now, your executive committee recommended that we take the time to work out the minimum allocations, call it out as a work in progress, and state in the ordinance that there'll be no allocation reductions considered until the minimum allocations are in place. And based on that recommendation, the red line draft, we added this sentence that no reductions will occur until such time as a fixed minimum allocation for agricultural operators has been established in accordance with Article 8, which is the article on minimum allocation. So in order to improve the agency's knowledge of how the water is used, so we can model it better moving into the future and understand where it's being applied and better able to sustainably manage the basin, we included additional reporting requirements. It's the same language that's in the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley Basin Allocation Ordinance that your board passed. And it includes additional reporting for ag operators, include parcel numbers, irrigated acres of each parcel, and the source of all water used to irrigate those parcels. For ag water purveyors, including mutual water companies, special districts, municipalities, additional reporting would be total volume of water from each source, location identifier of the turnout, water deliveries, to the meter and readings from each turnout, the parcels served by each meter and turnout, and the customer name associated with each parcel. I will say that we had a representative from Zone Water Company at the executive committee meeting who took exception to that last requirement. That last requirement is not nearly as important to understanding the water deliveries as the rest of them are. M&I water purveyor reporting would additionally include the total volume of water from each source being supplied, the monthly water deliveries for all water being supplied, and a list of parcels or a GIS shapefile of those parcels being served. And lastly, domestic and individual M&I operator reporting would be to just list the parcels supplied by that operator's extraction facility. Allocation carryover, as we discussed last meeting, the white paper had identified carryover as an important need, but hadn't identified or worked out how that would work. So we've included the same carryover methodology that's in the LPV allocation ordinance, which allows an operator to carry over up to 50% of their allocation that's unused in any 1 year, and a total of 100% of the current year annual allocation could be carried over into the next year. The first water used in any year is deemed an exercise of the carried over water, and carried over allocation expires after 5 years. And lastly, as for administering this and accounting for it, any allocation carryover for extraction facilities are combined into a COM code, it would just be evenly divided among the combined extraction facilities. Allocation transfers or temporary assignments of allocation may be approved, but they may not be transferred for outside of the basin or from one management area to the other. One question that was raised in the executive committee was about grandfathered water purveyors that were exporting water and grandfathered into continued use, that had been doing that since before the agency was formed. This would not affect those grandfathered water purveyor operations. The allocation ordinance states that minimum allocations are not transferable. And for operators with wells in more than one management area, if there's special cases such as zone and Waterworks District 19 we talked about, they transfer that allocation between their commonly operated wells, but then they have to make it up. And the idea here is that since each management area has its own allocation pool that everybody's drawing from in that management area, and these operators have wells in both, they can't disproportionately extract from one management area or the other management area indefinitely that is beyond the allocation of their wells in that management area. The draft ordinance said that that would be made up in the following water year. The executive committee, the zone representative said that requirement, especially the 1 year requirement, was not compatible with their operations, but did not have a specific recommendation for how to address that. The executive committee recommended that could consider longer payback than a 1 year period, but did not land on a particular recommended period, whether that be 2 or 3 or whatever years. So coming back to reserve allocation, you recall that the reserve allocation pools have been established in each of the east and west management area. These are principally there to provide allocation. The lands developed in the basin after the base period. The reserve allocation is limited to water in the reserve allocation pools, and any reserve allocation would be set to an amount equal to the minimum allocation. The draft ordinance included language that would provide the authority for the agency to adjust the east or west management area pool 1 yield shares, provide additional allocation to the reserve allocation pools. At the executive committee meeting, stakeholders felt that was not consistent with what the intent of the white paper was, and that should not be part of the ordinance. And the executive committee recommended that there not be a provision for reallocating to those reserve allocation pools. So in the red line version, we have struck that authority. This is a lot of text, but in the strikeout, the authority giving the agency ability to reallocate that as we struck. We did add a clause that the agency may amend the ordinance to provide additional reserve allocations consistent with a final judgment entered in the adjudication. There's a priority list of how that reserve allocation would be provided. And there's we've been through this before, and this is straight from the white paper. And there's a requirement that any minimum allocation be demonstrated to be put to beneficial use for a period of 10 years, or else it goes back to the allocation pool. The ordinance has variance procedure. This is very similar to the ordinance code variance procedure, as well as the variance procedure in the LPV. Request a variance from the requirements of the ordinance. But the sole purpose is to make sure that an owner-operator can make reasonable use of groundwater in the same manner as other users in the management area or basin. There are standards to which an applicant must demonstrate that granting a variance would meet, such as the granting of the variance would not confer special privilege, denial of the variance would result in practical difficulties or unnecessary hardships, granting the variance would not be consistent with SGMA or other ordinances, and that granting the variance would not substantially impede the agency's ability to sustainably manage the basin. That burden is on the applicant, as it is in other variance procedures adopted by the agency. In the reduction of allocations section, there's no reductions considered in this ordinance now, but just states that the board may reduce allocations by a method to be determined in the future to bring the basin to sustainable yield in the year 2040. And as we talked about under minimum allocations, there's added requirement that no reduction will occur until such time as a fixed minimum allocation for agricultural operators has been established. So the effective date and operative dates of the draft ordinance will go into effect the 31st day after adoption and then become fully operative on October 1st of 2020. So that concludes my run through of the provisions of the ordinance. And so staff would recommend that your board receive and file this report, conduct a public hearing, conduct a first reading in title only of the ordinance, and set October 26, 2020 as the date for public hearing to consider adoption of the ordinance.
August 26th? I think you said October, Kim.
Did I say October? Yes, August. I'm sorry, August 26th. Thank you for that clarification, Chair West.
All right, thank you, Kim. A few things first. I want to thank the stakeholders who have written letters of concern and comment with respect to the proposed ordinance. They were helpful to the executive committee, as you could tell from the presentation. The executive committee went on and on and went for a long, long time discussing a lot of these points, and a lot of the comments that the comment letters that we get, we read, we take them seriously, and they have helped improve the drafts of the ordinance. I also want to thank Kim. I want to thank you. I want to thank staff for, we had what, a 3+ hour long executive committee meeting on Monday, and here we are by the end of the week, and a lot of the things that we discussed and the changes that we talked about at the executive committee have made their way into a revised version of the ordinance, and in the few hours between then and now, I'm sure that took a lot of work. I appreciate everything that went into that. So the still in all, having said that, I'm not sure that the ordinance is ready for prime time yet. There have been a sufficient number of changes in the last few days and an insufficient amount of time for the stakeholders to understand those changes and to see how those changes impact them. And I think before we ask the stakeholders to weigh in on this, they ought to have an opportunity to really understand it. And the board ought to have an opportunity to discuss it to understand how this affects stakeholders individually and collectively. We're just not there yet. In addition, by the way, I think the base period, or I'm sorry, the initial allocation change from the stipulated pool to the 2018 extraction allocation should go a long way, along with the corrections that were made to the wells that were in each various basin, to solve a lot of the concerns that we heard about at the executive committee meeting, but I don't know that yet. I want to be able to spend more time with that data and make sure I understand it. With respect to the minimum allocations, I still think that's way too complex. I mean, I understand its genesis. I understand that it came from the white paper. And I'm not quite sure, even having spent as much time with it as I have, I'm not quite sure how that gets implemented. And based on some of the comment letters, based on some of our discussions, well, there's got to be a simpler way. But that's one of my concerns, is that minimum allocation pool is terribly complex. In addition, I guess the last thing that was raised in some of the comment letters, is I think the ordinance does a good job of being true to the largest, most significant parts of the white paper. And that was always our intention. There was some concern that there were some other, perhaps less prominent parts that were of great importance in the balance that made up the recommendation to adopt that. And to the extent that that may be so, I would like to see some attempt made both on the part of staff and on the part of stakeholders to get together to see if there are parts of this ordinance that need to be better harmonized with the white paper to make it, I guess, more consistent with the intent of the folks that originally drafted the white paper. For those reasons, I guess ultimately what that means is I'm not so sure that, well, I'm reasonably sure that on October 1 implementation date is just not appropriate with this much work to do. I would like to see this come back in September or October for implementation in January, perhaps, but I think October is too soon. So those were my quick preliminary comments based on some of the notes. Oh, by the way, I want to make an aside to Mr. Gonzalez and to a couple of the other folks that submitted letters in advance of today's meeting. As you perhaps could tell from Kim's presentation, the concerns that you raised are clearly appropriate for the variance process. Land that wasn't in production, or we received some letters from different people whose property was either out of production or in a demised condition when they took it over after the base period. And so they don't have an allocation, or they have a de minimis allocation, even though they've brought those properties back into production. Those things would seem to me to be ideal for the variance process, and that's why that's in there. Again, those are my few comments with that. Any other members of the board have other comments before we?
Chairman West, this is Steve Bennett. Chairman West, this is Steve Bennett. I have a question.
You bet.
Yeah, my question for staff. It seems to me when we were coming up with the October 1 date for implementation, that the reason we were attracted to that is because it allowed for a complete cycle to all be carried out in that time period, October 1 to September 30. Can you refresh me on why we chose October 1 and why it happened to work? And could you then also answer the question, what will then be the impacts if we don't have implementation in October 1 and we instead have implementation on January 1, as Chairman West was suggesting?
So Director Bennett, the reason October 1 was targeted is because SGMA requires us to move into a water year reporting period. So that's October through September of the following year. And so that's why we're moving into October 1 with the LPV ordinance, and why it would have been to keep things in sync to get Las Posas into October start date if that worked out. That said, we did have to we did have a transition issue at the, to move into the October 1st date. And you recall that your board passed an ordinance to provide special allocation for that transition period of 3 or 2 months, depending on whether it's ag or M&I operators, to give allocation in the transition period when the existing allocation system's ending and the new one starting. In this case, if your board should so direct a January 1st start period, then we would just have to look to do a similar thing in the new allocation, because the first year would go from January 1st through September 30th. It wouldn't be an entire year, it'd be a 9-month period. So there just have to be some prorating, mindful prorating of that allocation to provide for a 9-month allocation in the implementation. And with the AMI data that we have now with monthly reporting, that really helped inform that transition ordinance. That I don't think we had any concerns from stakeholders that that ordinance had an inappropriate prorating of the allocation.
So you believe that, quote, mindful prorating could be achieved relatively, that's relatively doable for us to achieve that. Is that correct?
Yes, Director Bennett, yes it is.
Yeah. Okay, so you know, if Director West, I just suspect that Director West is looking at this, I suspect that this is, this postponement would be going. Director West, if I could just ask you, you said September, October. Do you have a specific date when you would want the first read to come back to this board so that at this point?
I don't. I just want to make sure that we have time enough so that we have time between the reading and the adoption and before implementation so that we don't run into any regulatory problems.
But your intention would be to have something come back in September and then adopted.
October, if that's, you know,
adopted.
we have to have 31 days between adoption and implementation at a minimum. So if we're talking, well, if we're talking January 1, it could come back as late as November if we're only concerned about 31 days. But I would like to see the board, I'd like to see the work get done sooner, the board act sooner, and the public, the stakeholders have time enough to work into implementation rather than have to do it overnight.
All right, thank you very much.
Any other board members?
Kim, could you take down the presentation so I could see the other board members? It just feels like I'm operating blind here. Thank you. I think you summarized everything quite well, Chair West, and I would agree with your summation of all these issues and would go along with your recommendation.
Thank you. Any other comments from the board before we open it up to the public?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Let me go ahead and I'll echo what Mr. Borchard had to say. Some of the letters that we've received in the last couple of days, and in particular from Mr. McLaughlin and Ms. Waters, to me, raise in my mind valid issues that merit further discussion regarding the proposed ordinance. I'd like to see staff and shareholders meet further and address those issues. I'd like them to report back so that I have more of a chance to reflect on it. I guess secondly, I think it's important that to the greatest extent possible, we try to address these issues in the draft ordinance prior to its adoption. And I agree with the proposed timeline that we have. I think there is, I want to say thank you to staff. I also think that there is still some substantial work to be done. Thanks.
Director Mobley, any comments at this time?
No, I concur with Director Tremblay's comments. But I would just encourage the stakeholders to, and the attorneys to not let this just slip by. I mean, if we're anxious to get this done, and hopefully we can get it done by, say, and implemented and effective by January 1st. So that doesn't give everyone a lot of time. So I would just work hard to let's get this last details finished and wrapped up so we can complete the ordinance. I think it just needs a little tweaking here and there. It's really not that much, but yeah, let's get this done and not push it into 2021. That's it.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, with that, let me ask if there are any questions or comments from the public. If you wish to be heard, raise your hand so the clerk of the board can recognize you.
Mr. McLaughlin?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Can the board hear me, Chair West?
Yes, you can.
Thank you, Chair West and members of the board. I want to start by commending and thanking GMA staff for the diligent work on this ordinance. I want to also state that I very much appreciate the comments we just heard from you, Chair West, and the board for seeking to resolve these issues. I just really am relieved that I think there is a consensus emerging, and the fastest route to sustainable management for this basin is through a broadly supported negotiated consensus. I think I represent a large group of agricultural pumpers, and together with Mr. Saperstein, who represents other pumpers, we issued a letter urging a postponement of the adoption of the ordinance for a year. I hear the comments for January 1st. I think there is a compelling reason to extend that, and it's not to sit on our hands and postpone facing the demands for sustainable management here. It would be a year for the pumpers to work hand in hand with the GMA staff, and I want to emphasize, I think ideally 1 or 2 board members, representatives to also participate if desired, to hammer out these details, including the data and the making sure that the outcome is consistent with LPUG, and most importantly, realizes an equitable result consistent with background water rights principles. But we also should be thinking about making this result coordinated with and adopted by Judge Anderley in the adjudication. And that's going to take a little bit of time. Thus, if we did that, we would avoid the need to redo the ordinance and avoid conflict that may accompany adopting the ordinance outside of the adjudication, particularly if we haven't vetted all the issues. And so I think we should set, my recommendation would be to set October 1st of 2021 is an absolute hard, will take effect deadline, creating the impetus for all of the parties, including staff, to work together to try to come up and have the sufficient time to hammer out all these details. Meanwhile, the ordinance would continue. We think that provides sufficient protection. So I think I would just close by saying, I think that we've come 80% of the way. There's been tremendous effort to try to recognize LPUG white paper approach, find consensus, but that last 20% is very important. As I think Director Mobley said, we need to address these finite points, and we need to not sit on our hands and postpone them, but take them up right away and try to resolve them together with and push them through the courts so that it is one unified approach. Hopefully that consensus will also lead to the other important aspects of management, including agreements on refining the data to hone our understanding of the yield, and also implementing projects so we can sustain the economic enterprises that depend on this basin. Thank you for taking our comments and reviewing our letter.
Thank you, Russ. Anyone else?
Mr. Goldenring?
Yes.
Chair West, can you hear me?
Barely.
How's that, better?
A little better, yes.
Okay.
I apologize. I want to take this opportunity to thank you and the other directors for your thought process around this. As you know, we represent the plaintiffs in the pending litigation, which I think number close to 70 at this point, and broadly include agriculture, industry, folks whose land is not yet planted, folks who have orchards that have been cycling through. So we represent a whole broad spectrum of folks, and they all need to look at what is being proposed because it is obviously so consequential. And as you commented, there has not been much time to do that. We would be happy to engage constructively to try to work through these issues. One of the things that might be helpful, because it's not happening, at least I'm not seeing it, is that as the letters have come in, they don't seem to get posted or they're not being disseminated. So it would be helpful to, I think, everybody if there would be a way to disseminate either directly to the lawyers or by posting promptly in some fashion all the various letters. And then, at least from my point of view, we'll be able to understand what all the different issues or thought processes are that are on the table, and then take those into account in terms of moving forward. From our point of view, we think that what might make sense, rather than picking a hard date to come back with an ordinance, is to perhaps, given that even with a January 2021 timeframe, as you commented, Chair West, there's really plenty of time. I would like to see all these comment letters disseminated or posted so everybody can see them. And then we can start these conversations, figure out the best way to move forward, whether it's in some fashion directly with staff or in Zoom meetings, perhaps cycling back into another mediation. There's a lot of different methodologies to try to get the conversation happening around this, and then perhaps come back to the board on a report on status and a conversation towards the end of September. At that point, then I think we'll all have some clarity. Are we moving forward? Is it happening? Is it not happening? And then that gives you folks as the board an opportunity to think through how you want to move forward with plenty of time to do it. So that's what I'm thinking on behalf of the plaintiffs. And thanks so much for listening.
Thank you.
Brianna?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Oops, no. Hello? Rihanna, we heard that. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you.
Okay, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, my name is Rihanna Noyes, and I have a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and a Master's in Mathematical Finance from USC. I work for Fuller Falls Mutual Water Company, and prior to that, I worked at a litigation consulting firm performing statistical analysis and also was a statistics teacher for 2 years. It is my professional opinion that the methodology put forth in the draft ordinance is not a good measure for calculating the initial allocations for the ag operators. Specifically, using the maximum assigns more allocation to operators which use significantly more water certain years than other years. These outliers are skewing the percentages for the farmers who have been using a consistent and efficient amount of water. In fact, most of these historical averages are based on a time period prior to 2015, when the emergency ordinance E was not in effect and did not take into account crop type, geographic location, season, and other factors. For instance, ELPMA well 02N20W171L01 is awarded 1,200 acre feet in this proposed draft because they averaged 1,500 acre feet in this 2009 to 2013 period, despite the fact their average from 2015, 18, and 19 was only 559 acre foot. Therefore, they're being rewarded with higher allocation than even their average had been. A better methodology would have been to use average, not maximum, over a 10-year period, for example, from 2009 to 2019. This would give more accurate representations of actual water usage over the period than using a total based on averages to assign allocations accordingly. Under the current method proposed in the draft, the total used to calculate the pro rata calculation is based on a maximum. This produces a number that is far higher than has ever even been pumped in any of the years shown on the data, and is therefore highly unrealistic. To put this in perspective, under the proposed methodology, my water company's percentage of the pie is almost a full % lower than our actual percentage of usage in either of the base years period. If Fox and Canyon proposed method is approved, the resulting allocation for my water company would lead to a 25 to 30% reduction in allocation from the current IAI during a wet year, and a 35 to 40% reduction in allocation from the current IAI during a dry year. I ask this draft not be approved. It is based on unrealistic maximum pumping figures. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rihanna. My only comment is that the methodology is far more complex than the math. And there are reasons for that. And if this were as simple an exercise as figuring out the size of the pool and the number of straws feeding off of it, we wouldn't have been at it for 5 years. But again, it's a long, complex process. The methodology itself was the process of years of negotiations between and among the stakeholders most directly affected. I'm concerned about the shortage that the formula provides the water company that you mentioned. I'd like to know more about that, perhaps not during this meeting, but I'd like to know more about that, because particularly that was something that was discussed extensively at the executive committee meeting. And that's why you saw the change in allocation pools from that, what we call the STIP pool, to the 2018 extraction pool, was that made a huge difference and should have solved the kind of problems that you're talking about. But if there are particular issues, that's something that I recommend that you discuss with staff.
Sure, I have taken those into consideration and do have that new number in my figures as well, though, with the 25 to 30% reduction, 35 to 40% reduction. And I'm happy to do an analysis on all the water companies since the data is here to see, but I would venture to guess because the majority of them are going to be losing significant allocation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Grether?
John, if you can hear us, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Keely, do you have to mute the previous caller? Oh, okay.
Have to.
John, we still can't hear you.
How about now? I'm sorry.
Now we can hear you.
I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was muted. Again, I'll start over. Thank you. I appreciate the efforts of Mr. Loeb, is where I started a second ago, because he's been very responsive to some of the errors that we noted as to wells that were not included, erroneous numbers. He's been very quick at getting a turnaround on those, and that's been very helpful. It makes me have concerns, though, that some of us have been diligent about comparing the numbers, and we have spotted individual problems, and yet there are literally hundreds of other wells on the schedule that perhaps have not been reviewed. I think that it would be very appropriate to have a very full vetting of all the individual wells. It doesn't have to be by a large group. I think a committee of representatives, including the board and staff, would do a very good job of this. And I also would add that it might be appropriate to have CBI be the moderator or mediator of the process to facilitate it. The reason that this is important is that every individual number has a bearing on everyone else's allocation. So to have some allocations be misrepresented or omitted or whatever the circumstances might be has an impact on every other pumper in that west or east basin. So it's extremely critical. I was an active member of the LPUG Allocation Committee. We met many times for weeks on end. And when we looked at the data, and we never had as complete data as what Mr. Loeb has provided on the website, but when we looked at the data, we realized that to get it right, it would take probably a year to sort it out. There's just so much complexity to individual circumstances that you can't quickly just make a guess at it. And I think it would be appropriate to take the time to do it right. It's also particularly hard here because this ordinance, although it has an allocation carryover, it doesn't have an adjustment at the front end if we happen to have a dry year. Some of us would have, if it's a dry year, could have extreme penalties. It's a big risk. And without an adjustment, without a water market, without a lot of, we don't have, as compared to the Oxnard Basin, we don't have as many opportunities for a surface water alternative. We need to look at projects, and that's another story, but we don't have many alternatives to groundwater. And so it's very important that the numbers are right and they're numbers that we can live with. I would close by, you know, we're often criticized as pumpers of saying that we want to kick the can down the road and postpone and postpone. And I understand that sentiment, but I would offer another analogy that's often used by the carpenters and the sewers and the sail makers. If you want to measure twice and cut once, you don't want to make mistakes at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Levens Ranches.
Hi, I think this is me. This is Derek Knoble with Levens Ranches. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to follow up on what Ms. Noyes and Mr. Grether pointed out. It's just a lot to swallow in a short period of time. So as I've been speaking to Mr. Loeb, and I'm grateful for his time, I want to ask him question number one, and that how accurate do you think this data is as presented today? And I will just say that you know, the change overnight was 60 acre-feet for us. Just by moving one well to another, it's huge impacts that we need to swallow. So what are you thinking, Kim, on this one, this version? Are we getting close?
Chair West,
did you hear the question?
I did. Okay, I just wanted to see whether you wanted me to follow up there.
Go right ahead.
Yeah, Derek, I think these are close. These are preliminary data, as we've noted. And so I think that some of the complications that we saw, you know, with some wells with multiple meters and some other things have been addressed. So I think they're still preliminary data, though. I don't think they are fully completed and QC'd. which we fully intended to do, based on the board's direction on how to proceed on this, and we will do so.
Very good. Thank you, Kim and directors. I'm just going to point it out from a grower's point of view that, not having the final numbers, it's pretty hard to act, especially in a few months, and try to figure out what to do if you are under the allocations. And it doesn't start raining once a week at 1 inch rate. But a couple other things. We are also smack in the middle of the Epworth management area, and we have 4 wells that are actually listed as Fox Canyon, but are in Epworth. So just understanding the dynamic of which pool are we in, can you transfer water in and out, is just going to be a lot to swallow. We're going with the flow right now, but that's part of the process that we need to kind of understand on which hat we put our wells in. The other thing is we do have unplanted ground, so reserve allocations, and trying to understand that process. Do I abandon, some of our poorer ground and plant some of the other ground out of the reserves fall in? A lot of these things, it's just very complex, and even moving it to January doesn't help us try to swallow how we're going to attack next year. And also, I want to mention that we are also very interested in projects or importation of water, but don't really understand the dynamic yet and some of the physical things. We're beginning discussions with county staff, but there really isn't anything in the ordinance that's addressing, other than a project, these major shifts, which we may be forced to do as we're farming on the very, very east end of the basin, which is the hottest, driest, and almost sandiest ground. And it's a lot different than Las Posas. Oxnard, Pleasant Valley, deep silt loam soils, and I think we all know that, but there was some discussion about looking at experts' opinions on minimums, but if you're pushing the minimums out of the way, I'm okay with that for now. So those are my comments, and I thank you very much for hearing us today, and hopefully I didn't deviate too much.
Thank you, Derek.
Alma?
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Hello?
Yes, Alma, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Good afternoon, Chair West and other members of the board. I just want to echo John Grether's comments and others that have been commenting. And I appreciate all the work that's been done on this allocation table and the draft ordinance. And I do recognize that assigning allocations is a complex process. We don't feel that this table is ready, or the allocation ordinance is ready for an October 1st implementation. And I think that we all need to work together and make sure that those numbers, the initial allocation numbers, are correct. That initial allocation table has been revised twice over the last 8 days since it was first published, due to errors and omissions that were encountered, which staff has since corrected. As an example of those errors, I wanted to ask Kim if he could go back to the slide that showed the summary of the extractions for the east, west, and total extractions. Can you please put that slide back up on the board?
Hang on a second, let me pull that up.
That one. Yes, the preliminary draft initial allocations table. So if you take a look at the 2018 extractions and 2019 extractions for both the east, west, and total, those numbers don't match what has been provided to us and what's currently available on the FCGMA website. I'm not sure why those numbers are not the same as what we've been given, but I don't know if this means that there's more work to be done, and I don't even know which of the two tables is the most current at this point. Clearly more work is needed, more refinement, and I would even go as far as recommending that a third party evaluate the data and really validate that it's correct. That's my opinion, and I don't think that this is ready for an October 1st implementation. There's still work to be done on that initial allocation table. Kim, do you know why those numbers don't match what we have?
I don't know what you have, so I can't really comment on that.
It's the one that's posted on the FCGMA website dated August 12th. They're different numbers than what you have on this table here. And I don't know which of the two is the most current. Anyway, there's just discrepancies in it. Be aware of it. And I think there's more work needed on this table.
It is possible that I transformed those, transposed a number or something when I was putting it onto this slide. The numbers in the table are calculated values. So it is possible that in this slide, there could be an error in the slide, but I would rely on that table.
Okay. It's just a big difference is all.
Okay.
Okay, that was it. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that the current draft ordinance doesn't address in lieu water deliveries for those water purveyors that may have taken advantage of temporary in lieu water deliveries during the base periods. And it doesn't address how those in lieu water deliveries are going to be treated. In order for zone to be able to plan for the future, we need to know how in lieu water will be treated for the purposes of establishing an initial allocation. And that's all.
Thank you, Alma. And just a comment, if I may, by the way, the fact that there have been multiple changes in the table as more information becomes available should, basically it tells me we're trying to get this right. Now, there will be more changes, and I'd encourage you, and again, this isn't just for you, Alma, but I'd encourage everybody to take a look at the well data relative to, your production on that table. And if you see there's a well missing, or if you think a well is in the wrong basin, those have been the changes that have made the biggest difference. If you see something like that, let us know. We want to get this fixed, and we want to make sure that it's done right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. McGuire?
Neil, you're muted. Neil, can you hear us? Because your mic is on mute. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can.
Sorry, I got flipped on and then off again. Good afternoon, Chair West and members of the board. In light of where we appear to be headed, I'm going to save most of my comments and thank staff and Mr. Loeb for all of the work that's been done this past week, while also echoing that there is still a lot of work to be done with regard to the ordinance. We do need to get the underlying data correct. Chair West, you mentioned looking at data. We are looking at our well data. We do have several outstanding issues that we need to work through. We also need to deal with items like the minimum allocations and the reserve requests. So I'm supportive of the scheduling approach that Mr. Goldenring offered up, and I'll commit to working through these issues with staff as quickly as possible to try to get us where we need to be with regard to this ordinance. So thank you for your consideration, and look forward to getting this done.
Thank you, Neil.
Mr. Saperstein?
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Thanks. And Chair West, again, keep my comments brief. I wanted to just talk about realistic expectations, and I'm concerned that if the only thing that Kim and GMA staff had to do was focus on this, October might be realistic or December might be realistic. But on top of all of that, Kim and GMA staff have got all the other SGMA related implementation issues for 3, 4, 5 basins. It's a tremendous amount of work, and you're hearing from multiple folks the need to be careful, as John says, measure twice, cut once. It's really critical to get this done well, get it done to the least negative impact on the pumpers. And I just want to put in perspective how things are perhaps a little different now than they were, and they even are still in the OPV. And I'll say this, sound a little flip, but I have to thank Mr. Goldenring and plaintiffs in that folks are not going away. We have litigation that will focus on this issue, and the interstate allocation among the pumpers will get decided by the court. We're hoping that's done sooner than later. And so the framework is different in Las Posas than it perhaps is in the OPV, in that we have a judge that's watching over our shoulder on top of side by side with the GMA board, and making sure this is both done consistent with California law, consistent with GMA's obligations under SGMA. All of that will happen timely. And so I understand the inclination, the need to want to set some real firm deadlines to move this along. And I think you're hearing from all of the folks that have made comments today, and I'm sure all the others that are listening, are willing to put whatever time and efforts needed to get this done. Again, get it done accurately, get it done respectfully to the LPUG white paper. But I would hate that we invest a whole bunch of time spinning our wheels only to acknowledge that perhaps January 1st is still an unrealistic deadline. And the last thing I'd say, put a little broader context around the comments that Kim made over the expectations in the white paper, to the extent that's relevant. The 12 to 18 month test drive that the LPUG folks had considered was not just concerning developing a good minimum allocation. It was the overall construct of making sure data was done accurately, to make sure that variances were processed, and to ensure that that minimum allocation, and I'll speak to that just in a second, that minimum allocation was done accurately, along with all the other critical components of the white paper. And a minimum allocation is, again, a good example. It's the framing that Kim has presented it as, okay, we don't want to impose reductions until a minimum was set. Well, that wasn't the only purpose for the minimum allocation. Was not only for folks who had to start with a relatively low allocation that wouldn't get reduced below it, but it was to bring up other similarly situated groundwater users to a functional minimum allocation, so that they could start at a place that wouldn't destroy their businesses. So it's just critical. Just one example of many components of the white paper, to which a lot of thought went into, and the expectation was we would be careful over the first 12 months or so of implementation, so that these folks that have been farming in this community for generations, many over a century, can continue to do what they're doing, so that the world looks pretty similar to what it does now into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob.
Ms. Craviotto?
Hi, I wanted to say good afternoon to the board and everyone that's Mr. Loeb working on all this. I know that you've put hours and hours and hours into it, and it's not an easy job. I am a farmer, and we farm avocados in the Fuller Falls, which Rihanna spoke about the allocation and how it affects the water company. And when I just do the numbers based on the 2018, it's basically 181 acre foot of water that we wouldn't have. And I think part of that is because we're predominantly a 500 acre avocado farm, and avocados use more water than citrus. And I just want you to be aware that that probably wouldn't be sustainable for us. So it is a really big deal. And I just feel that there needs to be some kind of accommodation for crop yield and crop type and drought or no drought. And, you know, and I also liked what Ms. Noyes said, because what she was saying is over the 10-year period, 2009 to 2019, because we are careful, we are efficient farmers, we do our best to keep our water use to what we can produce good fruit. We do produce about 1 to 2% of the avocados in California, just in my part of the ranch, which is only 213 acres. But it takes water to do that. And I wanted to say her taking the 10-year approach, it just seems to make a bigger difference for us. And I think that's because we're more efficient farmers. We weren't overusing water. And I just wanted you to take those comments into account as you're continuing to work on this. And I know that there is work to be done. And I thank you for what you have done so far.
Thank you, Lori.
Chair West, we do have a comment in the chat that I can read.
Yes, please.
Okay, it's from Tony Goff with Callejas. He writes, Chair West and FCGMA board members, Section 5.3 of the draft ordinance states, all extractions during a water year in excess of the allocations established by this ordinance shall be subject to extraction surcharges as provided in the agency ordinance code for extractions that exceed the historical and/or baseline allocation. I fear this could be interpreted to mean that Callejas would be required to pay surcharges to recover its previous stored water. I'm willing to work with the GMA staff to help resolve this issue, and he thanks you all.
Thank you. I don't think that's what that section was intended, how that section was intended to apply, and we'll work to get that clarified. Any other comments or chats, I guess?
Derek Knoble has a comment in the chat as well. He says, I have compared our well historical data to your well records presented in your sheet. After transforming the numbers into calendar year format, your data is spot on for our wells.
Nice to hear. Thank you, Derek. Anyone else?
No other comments seen, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, returning then to discussion among the board. Yeah, I haven't heard anything that suggests that the recommendations I made earlier shouldn't be, you know, the direction of the board to staff. There's a lot of work to do, and if there's time enough to get it done, great. If not, someone will come and tell us. But you know, at this point, I would, I guess that would be my recommendation, unless anybody on the board feels differently. At this point, I think staff's received the direction from the board. We're not ready to adopt this ordinance. We want it to come back, and I think we've outlined the work that needs to be done. So let's see, we don't have an executive officer's report because this is a special meeting. Anything else from the board or from staff before we adjourn the meeting?
Not for me.
With that, thank you, everyone. We're adjourned until our regular meeting, I believe, on the 26th. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.